further ado, help me welcome my colleague, Daniel Kreiss.
Thank you. All right. First of all, thank you to Laura for hosting, and it's great to see familiar faces like Professor Freelon in the room. It's an honor for me to be here, just 4 hours to the south, and I apologize for being a couple minutes late. My Apple GPS sent me in the wrong direction down Mass Ave, so chaos ensued. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about the book that Laura just mentioned, which traces the history of the uptake of new media in Democratic Party political campaigning over the last decade. And what I can do later is talk a bit more in the Q&A about why I choose to focus on Democratic Party campaigning. But let me just say a quick word about that now. As you'll see, I want to tell the history in some depth and detail. And the two parties in the states have a very different institutional history. They have a very different set of firms that service them. And really, to tell the story completely and fully, it took me a book just to focus on the Democratic side of things. So I'll happy to talk a little bit more in the Q&A about what we saw this cycle, particularly at the presidential level. But I think the two parties have very different institutional histories in terms of their uptake of new media and how they've used political technologies in campaigning over much of the last decade. Let me just say a little bit more about what I'm going to do today. I know it's a little faded, but I'll talk through this as best as possible. First of all, I want to sort of start out by telling a little bit more about how I came to this work and some of the paradigmatic scholarly accounts that we have about thinking about political collective action and political technologies as a way of framing it. And then I'll talk a bit about the methods that I had for this particular book before I really sort of get into the history. And what I want to do is sort of tell a history really that encompasses the last decade, but do so through really teasing out three analytical moments, thinking about how innovation happens in political technologies and political campaigning, thinking about the role of infrastructure in political campaigning, something that Laura has written quite extensively about, and then third, talking about organization and how important organizational processes are when we think about things like new media. And then finally, I'm going to step back, take a bit of a 20,000-foot view and say, what does all this mean for democracy on a normative level? Something that Professor Freelon has written extensively about and wonderfully about. So those are the three big things that I want to do today. What I'll do is talk for about 40 minutes. Is that good? And then we'll sort of have an extensive Q&A. Let me just say a little bit more about how I came to this work. In early 2004, I was a master's student in journalism at Stanford. And having worked in electoral politics before in New York City, I was really fascinated to see whether this, which is an online role-playing game that was developed for the Dean campaign, would translate into this, which is a bit washed out, but it's really the online, on-the-ground, door-to-door sorts of electoral politicking that has sort of been prevalent in this country for the last century. And really, having worked in politics, I was very excited about all this energy that was taking shape around the Dean campaign, and I wanted to figure out what did it all mean. So as a journalism student, someone who was completely broke and probably a little bit crazy, I emailed a couple of volunteers who were in the Bay Area who were going to Iowa. They said, come on down and join us. So I flew in the middle of the night to Nebraska, drove a couple hours into Sioux City, Iowa, and just followed around a group of volunteers for a week, really as a journalism student to get a sense of what was happening. Little did I know at the time, way back in 2004, that experience would really sort of shape the sorts of questions that I asked really over the next decade through my doctoral work, through my work as a postdoc, and then ultimately in the book that I put in front of you now. We all know what happened to the Dean campaign. So here's sort of his infamous concession speech where the media said that he gave out a large scream. Dean underperformed expectations and placed third in the Iowa caucuses, and for the most part, that ended his bid. However, what I was really left at was a sense of how should we think about all this extraordinary online campaigning and volunteering that was taking shape around the Dean campaign? How do we understand it? And more importantly, how do we understand it from the prospects of, is this remaking democracy? Is it challenging political elites? Is it enabling more insurgent candidacies? Is it sparking a new era of civic renewal, et cetera? So what I did first was I turned to the literature, and I found a couple of paradigmatic accounts of how we should think about new media in politics. And I'm happy to talk about this a little bit more. The literature that I found in the middle of the decade looks a little bit different from where we are today. So I should say that, and I'll try to position my work against sort of where we are currently as well. But the general account, at least in the mid-2000s, was that changes in tools and the broader information environment was driving shifts in political practice. Much of this literature stems from work around collective action problems. So when you lower the cost of doing things like organizing, finding like-minded supporters, taking action, essentially what folks were arguing is that then you'd see new forms of collective action. The cost of taking and engaging in action would fall almost to zero. And that in generally, it would become a lot easier for political participation to take shape. And almost entirely in lieu of formal campaign organizations, which is claim number 2. So one of the things that I found, and certainly a lot of the people, the early interpreters of the Dean campaign would suggest, that we're starting to see citizen-driven political engagement that's taking shape entirely independently of formal political campaign organizations. Now, I'm going to challenge these accounts in a bit, particularly when I talk about the Obama campaign. But in general, the literature was sort of driven by this. So once you lower the costs of organizing, lower the costs of finding action, all of a sudden you're going to get this new peer-to-peer world, sort of organizing without organizations, as Clay Shirky has put it. And finally, there's a normative claim here. Generally, that electoral politics at the time increasingly entails this leveled form of non-hierarchical collaboration, but that it was also undermining political elites. And that's been an argument that a number of scholars have made in another domains, but the general idea is that the formal elites, the former elites, the formal bureaucracies of the past would gradually start to erode as you sort of had these new forms of organizing without organizations and these new forms of political participation. Now, I'm going to tell a bit of a different story, but that was really the sorts of answers that I found at the time. When I started this work, I had a couple of general framing questions that I thought were left out of this literature. First of all, I wondered about innovation. So why was it that the Dean campaign was the site of all these innovations in electoral technologies way back in 2004? How should we understand innovations in electoral politics? What were the processes that were taking shape? Secondly, as we move from 2004 to 2008, as a scholar, I was wondering what accounts for this massive change in scale? How is it that Dean broke records for fundraising during a primary campaign by raising $50 million in 2004, but Obama, 4 years later, raises $50 million in 1 month, and that was February 2008. So what accounts for that major shift? Is it just about changing social practices? Or is it about new technologies? Or is it about something else? And what is that something else? And finally, I really wanted to sort of figure out more generally, why was it that a lot of the early tools and practices that I saw in the Dean campaign seemed to be everywhere in politics by 2008? I sort of wanted to understand what was going on. So I did a couple things, and I'm happy to talk more about methods in the Q&A later on. The core of the book, and really much of my dissertation work over the last 5 years, has been interviews. So I interviewed over 60 political practitioners who were active on presidential campaign cycles in 2000, 2004, 2008, and now 2012. So they worked for presidential campaigns across these 4 cycles. I purposely selected and also did snowball sampling on both the Dean and the Obama campaigns. So for the Dean campaign, I interviewed nearly almost the entire internet department. On the Obama campaign, this was the new media, the head of the new media division, which was a senior staff position, as well as all the department heads within that new media division. And then line staffers, and then folks in other divisions. So people who worked for the field division, the chief technology officer of the campaign, et cetera. A number of whom have gone on and worked in the 2012 cycle. Secondly, we're sort of in this wonderful era where people produce accounts of what they did all the time. And some of that is sort of formal published accounts, such as David Plouffe, Obama's campaign manager's retrospective of 2008. But also generally, people write about their experience on things like listservs that go to technology industry consultants. People write about things on blogs, about what they did, the challenges they faced. what I wanted to do is I collected over 2,000 documents that were written about campaigns from 2000 on to 2008. And I wanted to weave them into a single coherent narrative. So which are the pieces that fit together, which don't quite fit together, and how can I sort of make sense of them from a perspective, from a historical perspective? And then third, I really wanted to get a sense of what it was like to be a volunteer back in 2008 and to use these tools. So I engaged in field work. I was a participant observer during the 2008 cycle. I enlisted well before it was clear that Obama would win the election as a precinct captain for him in San Francisco. And then I was also a virtual precinct captain for him in Laredo, Texas, and traveled to Nevada during the general election. And the idea is that I wanted to see sort of what these tools offered a highly engaged citizen. What sorts of functionality, what sorts of activities could I partake in? What was it like to experience being a volunteer in sort of the greatest sense of our political ethnographic tradition? Okay, I'll start by laying out the general historical argument. I'm not sure how well you could see this. But let me sort of pause one moment and say, I think one of the contributions my book makes is to even say that the uptake of technology in campaigning has a history, and we could trace that history over time. Many of our scholarly accounts tend to be ahistorical. They tend to focus on particular election cycles, and then after that cycle ends, everyone goes home. Journalists go home, scholars go home. Nobody thinks about what happens on the day after the election. So one of the things that I do is sort of follow what happens. And the argument that the book lays out is that it's the remnants of Dean's failed campaign. You can see all those people up there who go on to found an extraordinary array of consulting firms catering to Democratic candidates and Democratic interest groups, specializing in new media technologies. They go on to staff other campaigns like Kerry Edwards, John Edwards in 2008, Hillary Clinton in 2008. They found nonprofit organizations. They found organizations like Civic Space, that was essentially the diffusion point for the content management system Drupal in the United States. That's a whole other history, which I won't talk about today. But generally what happens is, in the remnants of Dean's failed run, his former staffers sort of took what they learned. So what worked on the Dean campaign, what didn't work, how do we make it more powerful, and then how do we carry it to other sites in the service of Democratic Party political campaigning? So from there, they go on to found this array of firms that are sort of arrayed in 2004. What I'll do is tell this history through the lens of one of those firms, Blue State Digital. Blue State Digital was founded by 4 former members of Dean's campaign, 3 of whom who came to the campaign from commercial technology sectors. What they did was they stayed in the political field after the election, and they went on to help build the core of the Democratic Party's voter database after Dean became chair. And they built Party Builder, which was the Democratic Party's online internet organizing platform. And essentially that became the prototype for myBarackObama.com in 2008. So it was all this work that was done in between elections that really built the infrastructure for the Obama's run in 2008. Okay, what I want to do is go a little bit deeper now into those moments. So innovation, infrastructure, and organization, and sort of show you how all this comes together. Let me start out by talking a bit about innovation in the cycle. This is Al Gore's webpage in 2000. And generally at this time, what scholars called brochureware was the general prevalent and the norm for campaign websites. So you could see general characteristics. They tend to be very text heavy. There's some interactivity, such as an online poll. But generally it's sort of a largely static site. The HTML versions of campaign literature that gets passed out outside of election booths or polling places. If you notice, one thing that's really missing here is the donate button. It doesn't appear on the front page, which we'll see sort of change in a big way later on. And importantly, the site looks like this for a key reason. The people who were developing websites for candidates in 2000 had a model user in mind. That user was an undecided voter who was going to be seeking out more information about candidates. So it was very much a normative ideal of sort of a citizen who desires to become very well informed and would go and look up substantive information about candidates online in advance of the election. Another important key is that there were no dedicated industry really servicing political campaigns at this time, and in fact well into 2004. Most of the technologies that the Dean and Clark campaigns used, which I'll say later, I'll tell a little bit more about later, were powered by software built for nonprofit organizations, Convio and Conterra in particular. And really they just didn't have the same capacity that a presidential campaign would need. And I'll say a little bit more about what that looked like. To give you an example of how there's no real developed industry, in essence, most campaign websites in the 2004 cycle looked a lot like Gore's. And this is Dean for America in early February 2003. All the candidates sort of had websites that looked like this well until 2003. And in fact, John Kerry's site only really becomes more dynamic at the end of the summer after he saw what Dean did. But as of February 2003, this is generally what campaign sites look like. Very much almost like the Gore model, very text heavy, very little interactivity. The contribute button appears, but it's at the top right corner. Volunteering is a little more emphasized, etc. But not a lot of community here, not a lot of interactivity here, and basically the same model user sort of still carries through. Now the story of the Dean campaign is actually one of disruptive innovation, because what drove at least the initial Dean phenomenon was a relatively new political technology, but not a new technology, was political blogging. So what happens is in 2002, a group of disaffected Democratic parts of the Democratic base was sort of annoyed with Democratic Party elites for continuing to sort of embrace George W. Bush's agenda, in particular the Iraq War. And in the run-up to the Iraq War, folks like Marcos Militzis of Daily Kos and Jerome Armstrong of MyDD started organizing and convening around candidates who were anti-war. Howard Dean was one of the most prominent. And essentially what they do is they create this entire alternative web presence for Howard Dean. So this is the Howard Dean 2004 blog. It is a blog that was entirely volunteer run. But what's important about it is that as a relatively new political technology, it starts to make Dean supporters visible to one another and provide affordances for organizing. So you can see sort of on the left here, they link not only to the official Dean website, but they're promoting things like making contributions. They're promoting Meetup, which was a new technology back in 2003, 2002 and 2003. In fact, when Meetup wanted to offer the Dean campaign the use, they offered all the candidates of the cycle the opportunity to use Meetup in a more formalized way for politics. They couldn't find the Dean website searching for it. They kept coming across Howard Dean 2004 first. So it was actually the Dean volunteers who then convinced the campaign to use Meetup as an organizational tool late in 2002, early in 2003. But there was also a forum, so people were starting to get involved to take action. And it was a way to be continually following the campaign and starting to organize on behalf of the candidate. Now what happens is late 2002, early 2003, Armstrong and Militzis, as well as Joe Trippi, who was consulting for Dean's run, and who later became the campaign manager, sort of saw all this energy taking shape around the Dean campaign. But they realized that there was an organizational problem. With all this energy out there, how do we get people working towards the stuff that we need? Electoral politics is very transactional. Candidates need money, they need volunteers, and ultimately they need votes, given our electoral institutions. Those are at a premium. So what Militzis and Armstrong and Trippi realized is what they wanted to do is sort of, how do we convene all these efforts going on around the campaign to be making sure that people are meeting our electoral priorities? So what they do is sort of create this new Dean platform. And the idea is that it would convene people who are outside of the campaign on these independent blogs around a common website and sort of get everybody working towards a collective end, the end that we need. So to do so, Trippi did two important and interesting things. The first is, A lot of the story of the innovation behind the Dean campaign is driven by people coming from outside of electoral politics, from the high-tech industry, from commercial technology sectors, into politics for the first time. And with them, they're carrying different skills, different tools, different knowledges, and different practices with them to the political field for the first time. As importantly, Trippy creates an internet department that has autonomy. So people are allowed to experiment. In fact, they're given free rein to experiment. What Trippy's charge is we don't necessarily need to know exactly how this is going to benefit the campaign in the near term, but we want you to sort of experiment and play and see what you can do. And that protects them a bit to be able to innovate and design new things. And indeed, a lot of the things that we now associate with the Dean campaign were actually innovations not just for the political field, but for the commercial sector at the time. So the Dean campaign actually it drove the use of Meetup in political campaigning. You could see sort of the contribute button, how much that's sort of up front and center today. They were the first to really drive that. They were the first to systematically use email as a fundraising and an organizational tool. And that really came from MoveOn, who spent a couple of people from MoveOn spent a while at the Dean campaign that summer and sort of taught them how to use political organizing through email. And as anyone who was on any email list this election cycle knows, email is still the killer app for much of political organizing. They also built an extraordinary array of new tools, et cetera, including event planning tools and an early social networking website called DeanLink. And indeed, and I always feel very old when I tell my undergraduates this, is like, imagine a time when Friendster was the dominant social network. They have no idea what Friendster was. And then I'm like, God, I'm really dating myself here. But the Dean campaign actually built an early social networking platform modeled on Friendster. The idea was that supporters would profile themselves, be able to link up with others, either geographically or affinity-based, such as pug owners for Dean, and then somehow take collective action, whether that was about knocking on doors in a neighborhood, whether that was about doing fundraisers for Dean or providing for visibility, et cetera. Importantly, the early kernel of myBarackObama.com comes out of the Dean campaign. It's the actual technology. And this is Project Commons, which is essentially an integrated social networking and event planning application, which they built both in-house on the campaign. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. Okay, so the Dean campaign was the site of all this innovation in politics. But it only gets him so far. Dean, of course, loses pretty much after the Iowa caucuses. He holds on to score second in New Hampshire. But for the most part, the campaign is over. The thing that his former staffers kept telling me was that even amid all the sadness and despair, even amid all the just weary exhaustion from having worked 20-hour days for a year to promote Dean's candidacy, his staffers' phones were ringing off the hook. Everyone wanted, quote unquote, and this kept coming back in my interviews, the Dean magic. People wanted these Dean tools. People wanted to use them in the service of their nonprofit organizations or their candidates, et cetera. So very importantly, Dean's folks stay in politics for the first time. Remember, a lot of them came from commercial technology sectors. They sense a market opportunity. They get involved in politics because of certain ideological and partisan commitments. So they see an opportunity to advance the Democratic Party's cause. So they stay in the field and they build new firms and new tools. And really, this sort of leads to the second sort of moment, which is talking about infrastructure building between elections. This is about all the hard work that happens when scholars and journalists go home. When nobody is paying attention, what happens in those party bureaucracies to reorganize things like a technology department, or to build new infrastructure, or to commission new databases and interfaces? So I'm going to tell two aspects of this history here. And it really runs through this firm, Blue State Digital. As I mentioned earlier, these four founders stay in the political field. Three of whom came from the tech sector. The other was a blogger, Joe Rospers. And essentially what they do is they start offering technology consulting services and organizing services to Democratic Party candidates, as well as its sort of affiliated allies in what political scientists would call the extended party network. And as importantly, what they do in addition to sort of these consulting services where they're offering sort of their skills and their expertise from what they learned on Dean, they actually take with them Dean's tool set. So after the election, Dean founded an organization called Democracy for America. Democracy for America provided Blue State Digital with the intellectual property in the Dean tools in order to sort of maintain them and build a platform for Democracy for America. And what Blue State did was sort of rebuild those tools, made them more integrated and more sophisticated. So the original Dean tool set, you could be a volunteer and have something like 50 different logins and passwords for every one of their separate applications. What Blue State Digital did was sort of integrate them into one platform, which I'll show you in a minute. After Dean becomes party chair in 2005, and I think one of the stories of my book is to sort of say all that he accomplished at the party that has largely gone less than heralded within Democratic Party circles. But I think that my book sort of says that he should play and take a large credit in history for his role in putting together the Democratic Party electoral machine that's still in place today. But he commissions two big infrastructure projects. The first is Vote Builder. Let me go back. Vote Builder is the name that refers to the Democratic Party's database and interface system. And I can't stress enough how much of a technical and a social accomplishment this was. Prior to Dean commissioning Vote Builder, the Democratic Party essentially had 50 different state voter databases. None of them were standardized. None of them ran on the same technologies. The information was not standardized, which essentially meant that a presidential candidate could not essentially query the entire electorate, could not query even Democratic Party voters or registered voters. And at the same time, his staffers or her staffers would have to know 50 different systems in order to engage in a primary campaign. The Republicans had a national party database as early as the mid-90s, although the dates on that are a little bit more complicated. But generally, what Dean does is he takes office and says, this is a big problem. When John Kerry ran, his voter technology in 3 critical states, swing states, collapsed in the days before the election. If you don't know who your voters are and don't know who you need to be turning out to vote, you're in trouble if you're a candidate, as we saw with Romney's Project Orca this election cycle. So what Dean does is sort of commission this infrastructure. So essentially what this is, and I'll sort of speak pretty briefly about it, the Dean campaign basically, Howard Dean created a agreement where the National Party would assume the maintenance of all the different Democratic Party voter databases and would keep them up as well as clean the data in response for being able to access all these state party databases. And what he did was standardized and formalized it across the board. He also commissioned a voter activation network, or the VAN, for anyone who's been campaigning before, to build the interface system. So this is essentially the geographic system that you could see that would be able to plot voters on a map to create walk lists. And just for anyone who's done any canvassing in the pre-VAN days knows, and I was a volunteer for Bill Bradley way back in 99, you would spend hours and hours and hours flipping through walk sheets, cutting turfs on maps, photocopying those maps, et cetera. This automated the process. It was a very key piece of infrastructure. The second thing Howard Dean did was create what was known as Party Builder, which is essentially version 2.0 of the Howard Dean tools. So you see lots of integration. You could create your own social network profile. You can organize groups. You could create events. You can fundraise for the campaign. You could blog, etc. And this was rolled out in advance of the 2006 midterm election cycles by Joe Rospers, who would later become Barack Obama's new media director in 2008. And indeed, essentially, myBarackObama.com in 2008 becomes version 3.0 of the original Dean tools, rebuilt and made more sophisticated. And you can sort of see a lot of the same functionality here, myBarackObama.com. Profile yourself, link up with friends, create groups, create events, and blog on behalf of the candidate. What's of note here, when I talked about scale earlier, it took Dean months and months and months of actual in-house technology development to be able to get to a point where he could support thousands of groups for Dean around the country taking action on behalf of him. Whereas 4 years later, the day Obama announces, thousands of groups on mybarackobama.com are created instantly to get to work for the candidate. So a key piece of infrastructure supports from day one a much more robust volunteer base being taken shape around the Obama campaign. And this plays a huge role in Super Tuesday, which I'll talk more about in a minute. Okay. Now, if the dominant story that I told you earlier was about this organizing without organizations, was about organizing in lieu of formal campaign organizations, I want to make a very strong argument that it's actually the exact opposite. That the way to understand the successful uptake of new media in electoral politics is through the lens of all the organizing that gets done behind the scenes in places like Chicago headquarters. And I'll say a little bit more about aspects of this in a minute. But the general story of the Obama campaign, I think, comes from what Chief Technology Officer Michael Slaby told me, who was later the Chief Integration Officer for 2012. It's the idea that there was lots of people mobilized around Barack Obama's candidacy, mobilized through rhetoric, through the political opportunity to elect a Democrat, through the candidate's charisma, through the fact that he was a blank slate in terms of electoral politics at the time. So all these people are mobilized. The question is, how do you translate that energy and that political desire into those resources I mentioned earlier, right? And those resources are money and message and votes. And new media was the key piece of that translation, that translating of energy into those resources campaigns need. And that's essentially what Slaby is referring to here. It wasn't the media, it was about the new media. It was about the role of that new media in translating energy into resources, whether that was fundraising dollars or boots on the ground. So let me say a little bit more about the organization of the Obama campaign. There's two key features that really jump out. The first is, as far as I could tell in doing the research for this book, was a novel organizational decision. It was to make Obama's, the head of his new media division, a senior staffer on the campaign. Now that's key for a couple of different reasons, not least of which is because it enables the new media team to have autonomy from other divisions on the campaign, like communications, like finance, and like field. But it also enables them to contend for resources, to make a case that they're deserving of organizational resources. That's a key decision that takes shape back in 2008. So you can see more generally, the Obama campaign organization was the result of really thinking deeply about how are we going to build the systems, how are we going to build the practices to really sort of work effectively with supporters to run this well-managed and essentially data-driven campaign back in 2008 that you've heard a lot this time. So these are the different divisions on the campaign. I'm going to focus on a couple things here. I'm going to focus on design, and I'm going to focus on analytics, and I'm going to say a little bit more about the internal organizing on the campaign and sort of show you how this organization worked to essentially translate those resources into, to translate energy into resources. First, let me say a word about design. So one of the things that generally has been lacking from the scholarly literature on electoral politics is the general sense of graphic design. The Obama campaign in 2008 and again in 2012 spent a lot of time thinking about what is and what is going to be our web design and our brand for Obama. The designers for Obama campaign were faced with a particular set of challenges. One, this is the junior senator of Illinois. So what they wanted to do is sort of create the sense that Obama was professional and running a professional campaign. So oftentimes you'll see very clean, very standardized typeface and fonts. That was all a very deliberate decision. So this Obama blue, that's sort of iconic now, was coordinated all the way down to the wrapper that was around the plane to the candidate's necktie. They coordinated that and standardized that across the entire campaign. The whole idea was that you were going to create this impression that Obama's a competent executive, running a very professional, very slick campaign. Another thing they did is what they wanted to do is sort of through design convey the historic moment of Obama's candidacy. If you sort of think back to 2008, Obama wasn't, except in extraordinary moments, addressing things often, like his role in history, etc. So what they would do is they went through archives of old civil rights photographs and would stylize the candidate's image on the basis of those photographs that they found. The idea was that you could conjure up associations for what this Obama candidacy meant to America. Same thing with things like choices of fonts. The font that the campaign uses is Gotham. And it's sort of a brilliant choice that folks sort of went back and said, what is a distinctly American font that we find throughout history in terms of our documents? So they thought about every element of this in a very detailed and deep way. Importantly, these networked interfaces become sort of this new site of political communication. So the idea was that the design would suffuse everything the volunteer was doing and serve as a way, what the social movement scholar has called, Deborah Gould has called a political horizon, which is to say that it would create a sort of cultural mobilization effect where you could go and inhabit this space and sort of feel inspired by the design of the Obama campaign and feel like you're working towards something. So volunteers would inhabit the campaign's design through its networked interface when they're using the myBarackObama.com tools, right? Which again is the third version of the original Dean tools, so enabling you to fundraise and to create events, et cetera, for the candidate. Now importantly, and this has sort of been a theme of the 2012 election as everyone's talking about data, it's a bit ahistorical to sort of imagine that this arose sort of on its own out of the 2012 campaign. In fact, the campaign was actively doing things like optimizing its web page and doing A/B testing of emails back in 2008. So I'll just say this a couple quick seconds. This is the splash page for the Obama campaign in 2008. The idea was that everything you saw here was tested to probabilistically increase the likelihood that you would take the action the campaign wanted you to take. And in this case, this was for a new person coming here. They want you to add your email address and your zip code and sign up. So what elements are tested? Whether this has a picture of the family versus just a picture of Obama versus a video of the candidate. Whether this button is red, whether it's square, whether it says learn more versus sign up. Whether this says join the movement versus enter your email address. Whether that says change we can believe in versus something else. All of those different discrete things were tested on this page to increase that likelihood that you would get them to add your email address in. And this is what it looked like at the back end. I know this is going to be really tough to see, but essentially this was the redesign for their splash page. Essentially what they're doing is displaying you content, and it's continually tested on the basis of the characteristics you have as a visitor. So whether you visited previously, whether you've signed up for the campaign's email list, whether you've made a donation, whether you've ordered a t-shirt, and whether you have an account on their social networking site. And then they're looking at your geolocation. So what precinct are you in? Is it a strong Democratic precinct, strong Republican, versus leaning Republican? And on the basis of those characteristics, so what they know about you in those categories, and what they know about where you're dialing in from geographically, they're going to ask you to do different things, right? So on one hand, they might ask you to make a donation. Another, they might ask you to make a larger donation and get a free t-shirt. In other cases, they're going to put you to work. They want you to be making phone calls into battleground states. Other cases, they want you to register to vote, etc. These systems are the backbone for what becomes much more sophisticated in 2012 that you read a lot about now in the media. Now, just in case you think sort of this is trivial, this is Slaby talking about what this meant to the campaign. $57 million, website optimization alone. And if you think about that in terms of what that means for a political campaign, that funds the entire state budget in 2 battleground states. Almost. Right? That's all those field offices, that vaunted Obama ground operation on election day. That's what optimization sort of gives you. It gives you those additional resources that enable you to do things like open field offices to then send people door to door. Okay, let me say a little bit about the 2012 election to sort of bring this up to date. How am I on time? Okay, let me bring this up to date a bit. this election cycle and sort of show how this history that I just told you that unfolded really across 3 election cycles can sort of help us understand sort of where we are today and where we just came from in this election. First of all, it's the growing importance really over the last decade of things like micro-targeting. And this is really premised on having vast storehouses of voter data that in some ways you can model and ultimately act upon in a real and rich way. Let me say very briefly how this works. The Dean database that I talked about before really has provided the core infrastructure for Democratic Party efforts. And essentially, what's in that database is a host of public information, so things like real estate records, vehicle registration records, et cetera. That's coupled with canvas information. So every time somebody knocks on your door, and in a swing state like Virginia, who many of you might live in, or in North Carolina, people are knocking at your door and they're having conversations with you about whether you're registered to vote, who you might be supporting, what issues might matter to you. All the results of those conversations make their way into the Democratic Party's database. And that becomes a stored set of information that then accrues across each election cycle. There's also commercial information. And commercial information runs the gamut from things like magazine subscription lists that get sold to things like credit card information or grocery club card purchases, et cetera. Some of the firms that service the Democratic Party claim to have over 500 to 600 points of data on every member of the electorate. And we generally know that this is true. And essentially what happens is that they take all of this data that's out there, and what they continually do, campaigns, firms that service campaigns, is they do random representative polls of the electorate. So they want to figure out who do Obama supporters look like? Who do people who are undecided but persuadable look like? Who are voters who are supporters who might be likely to turn out look like? And then who do voters who look like entirely Republicans look like? The idea is that you want to sort of create some set of correlated variables that look for like each one of those model voters, and then you layer that back onto your voter database. And you score every member of the electorate on a 0 to 100 scale. In 2008, the campaign had 1 scale. In 2012, the campaign had 4 different 0 to 100 scales tied to every member of the electorate. Okay? ProPublica has done wonderful reporting on this and sort of how this has come about. But this then becomes the basis for everything a campaign does. So every door you knock on versus every door you don't knock on. What you say on the doors that you knock on versus other doors that you might knock on. This drives decisions for doing things like online advertising, which I'll talk more about in a minute. This drives things like urging your friends in your social networks to vote. It's all based on this sort of targeting. And again, the very simple math here is campaigns want to turn those people out who are already supporting a candidate. They want to talk to those people who are liable to be persuaded, and they want to talk to them in a language that they're going to be responsive to. And essentially, you want to ignore all the other people from the other candidate, right? Because you don't want to waste your valuable resources on them. Now, a couple of other pieces. So once you have voter modeling in place, essentially what the Obama campaign did in 2012 was rebuild some of those earlier systems to respond more to what the campaign realized didn't work so well in 2008. And namely, they rebuilt myBarackObama.com and sort of made it into what became this election cycle Dashboard. And Dashboard had a bit of a different model. It was a geographic-based model where people could join teams that are tagged together through zip codes. And essentially, you would have a team leader, and you would be able to take a number of different actions for the campaign, many tested earlier on, so you could do things like plan events and knock on doors and make phone calls. Importantly, numbers were generated that tracked your progress on everything that you were doing. Your team leader would see that, and then folks in Chicago would see that. So they knew how much you were actually contributing to campaign and where they were weak so they could delegate other resources. And as importantly, all this was tied together with that voter database I mentioned before. Back in 2008, they didn't have that capacity. So when people used like the online calling tool into swing states, those were always low priority voter contacts because they didn't have a way of syncing databases in real time. And there's an organizational story there of how the field division works with the new media division. But this cycle, they're actually able to integrate the back end of those databases so that every time you're making a phone call, you're making a phone call to a highly targeted voter. So when we talk about marginal advantages the Obama campaign had on election day, this is one of them. It's just this simple organizational capacity to be much more efficient in your use of resources and be much more efficient in terms of who you're calling and what you're saying to who you're calling. Facebook and Twitter generally became also a background of new social media platforms this cycle. One of the things the Obama campaign did that was interesting and novel was figure out a way to people who signed up for the Obama Facebook app through the campaign were essentially asked in the weeks before the election to contact certain members within their friend networks to encourage them to go vote, to encourage them to register, et cetera. And in essence, all those targeted asks were done through this voter modeling I mentioned before. So if you were friends with people who lived in swing states, they would encourage you as a supporter to reach out to those people based on what they knew about who was in your supporter, your social network. So again, this is a story of how data fits with modeling, fits with new social networking platforms. And anyone who signed up to use the Obama Facebook app, for example, was essentially giving their public profile and their network information over to the campaign to use for these sorts of voter turnout events. The third big area of this campaign cycle that I think was new was online advertising, which received enormously increased investments. We're still waiting for the final numbers, but the Obama campaign alone looks like it's going to be about $70 million or so, just on online advertising. And again, a couple of the interesting things we see here is going back to once you have better data on the electorate and once you have better voter models, essentially you can do your online advertising targeting in a much more effective and much more efficient way. So we sort of had all the classic ways of advertising this cycle. So that was about buying banner ads on sites that were of high interest, such as newspaper sites on key dates during the campaign. So that would sort of hit everyone in a geographic area. You had behavioral advertising. So based on the characteristics of you surfing the web, how do you look like other people who are of interest to the campaign and their behavioral habits? And then you would send them an online ad on the basis of that. You saw lots of online advertising about doing things like giving information over to the campaign. So this is the Obama Biden Happy Birthday Barack, so you could go sign the card. Give your email address over the campaign, some basic information. The next ad you would see after you did this was sort of up the next rung of the ladder. They would then ask you for money, right? So essentially it was about sort of moving you in a progressive fashion. And then the new thing that we saw this cycle was essentially what's called in the industry matching, which is matching a real life identity of a person to an IP address. So that you're able to send up targeted ads on the basis of who you think is dialing in from that computer. Now, this is by no means 100% foolproof. It's about, from what I sort of hear and following the trade literature here, it's about 60 to 80% effective in terms of matching. But essentially what it enables a campaign to do is generate a list of names, say from their voter matching in, say, a key battleground state like North Carolina, give it over to a third-party firm, and then that third-party firm can essentially serve ads to them based on how they can match them to particular IP addresses, and then send them targeted advertising on the basis of that. And that seems to have been new this cycle, although initial steps were taken in 2008. Okay, lest I talk the whole time. Let me just conclude by saying a few words about what this history means generally for democratic practice. Obama, of course, was reelected. And I think one of the stories over the last decade is really the continual investment and building in this electoral infrastructure on the Democratic side of the aisle. And I'm happy to talk about why we might see discrepancies between Republicans and Democrats. But generally, a lot of that early history I mentioned, that history that runs through Dean's work at the party, and then work of firms like Blue State Digital, and then their skills that they carried with them when they became and occupied positions like the new media director on the Obama campaign, and again worked for the re-election bid, you see that accumulated wisdom and experience build up across election cycles. The tools get more sophisticated, they get more powerful, and as importantly, the practices around them, the practices for organizing volunteers, coordinating volunteers, get more sophisticated over time. What does this mean for democracy? So going back to those earlier normative claims I mentioned before, I think the story of a simple sort of peer-to-peer story of people organizing without organizations, of vast social movements emerging around candidates, doesn't quite get at everything. So on the one hand, it is true that citizens have a much expanded range of opportunities to engage in the political process. The costs of doing so are lower. As a PhD student, I could call into Nevada, a swing state, much easier than I would ever could, and have conversations with voters on the other end of my line. And in a lot of normative democratic theory, that's a good thing. People are engaged, people are civically engaged in the democratic process. It's easier to give money, it's easier to engage in micro donations. It is oftentimes a very much communal experience to be a volunteer for a candidate. And political science research suggests that early experiences engaged in politics might lead to a lifelong civic engagement. And that certainly is a good thing and normatively desirable. However, a lot of the story that I also tell here is not one that necessarily this has increased accountability over the positions that candidates take, or necessarily even made candidates more responsive to the needs of their grassroots and democratic supporters. Indeed, it seems that this massive increase in participation around campaigns, at least over the last decade, has come alongside the increased power and sophistication of campaigns at better guiding and tracking volunteer engagement, at better able to target the electorate, and to have more precise conversations with people. So I don't think we see a radically transformative democracy. I think we might see what Arkun Fung has called incremental changes, changes in what citizens can do at the grassroots level, but ultimately participation that's guided by electoral institutions. Citizens were not asked to crowdsource policy positions. They ultimately were asked to knock on doors and to raise money for candidates. And that really is sort of the electoral institutions that still guides the forms of new mediated participation that they take. So with that, I'll stop and happy to take questions. And you could follow me on Twitter or email me too if you have questions. But, yeah.